My name is Tim Barrett, and together with my fellow co-PIs, Paul Billy and Catherine Tackow, we are very happy to welcome you to today's program. It's the last in our Mellon Sawyer series, but our guests today are very special and they represent the thrust of this entire seminar. So we're really looking forward to the program. Marina Rustow received a BA from Yale University in 1990, 2 master's degrees from Columbia University in 1998 and 1999, and a PhD, again from Columbia in 2004. Between 2003 and 2015, she taught at Emory and Johns Hopkins Universities, and she is currently the Dori A. Zilka Professor of Jewish Civilization in the Near East and Professor of History at Princeton University. Dr. Rustow studies documents on paper and parchment preserved in the Cairo Geniza, an assortment of hundreds of thousands of legal documents, letters, and literary materials, many of them fragmentary, that were deposited in Cairo's Ben Ezra Synagogue over more than a millennium. Dr. Rustow directs the Princeton Genizah Lab, where she has been helping to initiate and execute collaborative projects related to Middle Eastern manuscript caches, including the expansion of an online database of images, descriptions, and transcriptions of several thousand texts. Dr. Rustow is the author of Heresy and the Politics of Community, The Jews of the Fatimid Caliphate, published in 2008, which won 2 Jewish Studies book prizes. She is currently finishing a book manuscript on Arabic documents of state reused for Hebrew script text. Dr. Rustow was a fellow at the American Academy in Rome in 2007, a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2014, and in 2015, a MacArthur Fellowship. That's a pretty decent run, I would say. I first met Marina Rustow at a recent MacArthur Fellows gathering where she gave a fascinating presentation on the Genizah story. I contacted my co-PIs, Paul and Catherine, here at the University of Iowa, and we quickly agreed it was essential to have Dr. Rustow take part in this seminar. This is Dr. Rustow's second attempt to make it to Iowa City, the first attempt having been foiled by air flight conundrums. In summary, we are delighted she is indeed with us here this morning. Please join me in welcoming Marina Rustow.
Thank you, Tim. I'm really happy to be here, doubly happy because it's the second try. When I was supposed to be here in December, I missed a huge number of people that I really wanted to meet and talk to, including Susan Whitfield from the International Dunhuang Project, with whom I later had lunch in Princeton about a month ago, so I finally did catch up with her. But to console myself from missing everything that went on in December, I spent about 3 months deep in a Dunhuang rabbit hole. I thought I should really educate myself. This is a slightly different paper from the one that I would have given in December because of, not just because of the Dunhuang rabbit hole, but because it's been 6 months of sabbatical, so there's been water under the bridge. It's also perhaps a slightly different talk from what you've been hearing in the seminar, in that I'm dealing mainly with documents rather than with books, although I will touch on books briefly. So I've been basically wandering around Asia, quite possibly irresponsibly, although not aimlessly. So I'm encouraged that this might be the one place that I can get feedback on all of Asia. Since the beginning of Oriental studies in Europe, there's been a widespread but mistaken notion that few documents survived from the Islamic Middle East before the Ottoman conquests in the 15th and 16th centuries. The comparison is most often to Latin Christian Europe, which is falsely supposed to have preserved more documents than the medieval Middle East. This is a claim made even by specialists, and a particularly strong version of it appeared in 1994 in Michael Chamberlain's book on the Muslim learned elite, the ulama, of medieval Syria. Chamberlain asks why we have an overwhelming abundance of compendia of the biographies of scholars in Arabic. This is a genre that's been drawn on in countless scholarly studies of the medieval Arabophone world. Perhaps the most successful of them, Richard Bullitt's conversion to Islam in the medieval period, where he did this completely ingenious thing of going into biographical dictionaries and taking all the patronymics and then plotting them by time, and distinguishing the Arabo-Muslim patronymics from the non-Muslim ones, to see how far back the conversion actually happened. And then he plotted it all on timelines, and correlated it with various historical events. And that was all done with biographical dictionaries, which was quite ingenious. But it's also partly making a virtue of a necessity. For decades, I mean, basically, since the beginning of this game, people have been sort of overwhelmed by the number of literary sources in Arabic, and have assumed that there's a dearth of documentary sources. So what Chamberlain did, his breakthrough, was to refrain from simply mining biographical compendia for information about the learned elite, and instead to ask why the genre of biographical dictionaries was so pervasive in the first place. So he concluded that biographical compendia were the main arena in which the learned elite competed for social power. In the high medieval Middle East, rulers maintained patrimonial, if not absolutist, claims. I should preface this by saying I disagree with every word of this paragraph. Considered most of the wealth of their subjects their own, and permitted other social bodies none of the formal autonomies they had in Europe. Individuals, households, religious bodies, and groups did not brandish documents as proofs of hereditary status, privilege, or property to the extent they did in the Latin West. Nor were their strategies of social reproduction recorded, sanctified, or fought out through documents to the extent they were in Europe. Hence the centrality of biographical dictionaries, which staked claims to juristic and literary expertise. So even though I completely disagree with this paragraph, I should say that the way he constructed the book is absolutely ingenious, and it was a real breakthrough. He was, in a way, the first person to take the linguistic turn seriously in Near Eastern studies and say, okay, let's focus on the source as a source, on this type of source, and why do we have so much of it, and kind of looking at the power-knowledge nexus. But here I want to focus on his claim that the medieval Middle East failed not only to preserve documents, but even to produce them in the first place. Because the consequences of making a statement like that are both substantive and methodological. For Chamberlain, because the medieval Middle East put little stock in written instruments, it lacked stable institutions, and the exercise of sovereign power was ad hoc, arbitrary, and unconstrained by anything but the ruler's whim. Where there are no archives, documents stored and organized so as to facilitate retrieval, there can be no administrative memory, no procedural predictability, and no political stability. The notion that there were few documents in the medieval Middle East plays into the image of caliphs and sultans as oriental despots, as autocrats who preferred personal patronage relationships to documented claims. And this in turn connects with the tradition of writing about the Middle East and South Asia that goes back as far as Montesquieu and says more about evolving notions of politics in Europe than anything else. And it's really amazing if you kind of trace the image of the oriental despot. There is quite literally a 500-year tradition in Western thought of kind of projecting notions of despotism onto the East. This goes right up through Max Weber. There was a book that was published about a decade ago called The Oriental Despot, which purports to try to actually understand Near Eastern systems of rule. So what Chamberlain assumes about Europe equally requires revision. If you consider the proportion of medieval Latin documents that were copied or summarized in cartularies rather than kept as originals in archives, it turns out that for the period before 1200, the Near East has actually preserved more original documents than Europe has. This is a point that was first brought to my attention by Adam Costo. The thing is that the vast majority of these Middle Eastern documents languish neglected in library collections precisely because of statements like Chamberlain's. So we continue to train people to rely on chronicles rather than documents, and that's the methodological issue. In 1997, Frédéric Baudin of the University of Liège discovered an Arabic manuscript in his own university library. It was a draft notebook of the great Egyptian chronicler al-Maqrizi. So if you don't know about al-Maqrizi, if you've never read him, welcome to medieval Egypt's version of Europe's early modern republic of letters. Al-Maqrizi was an antiquary and an encyclopedist who served in a dizzying variety of public positions in the Mamluk administration in Egypt and Syria. He wrote dozens of historical works on the history of Egypt and its ulama, on coinage, weights, and measures, which is an unusual topic for his age, on famines, and on the urban geography and architecture of Cairo, which is a kind of startlingly modern way of slicing his information. Al-Maqrizi's historical scholarship was probably inspired to some degree by his mentor Ibn Khaldun. There's not a whole lot known about the relationship between the two men, but it is known that Al-Maqrizi once read Ibn Khaldun's horoscope and used it to predict when Ibn Khaldun would be reappointed to office. And if that's not intimacy, I don't know what is. So to discover Al-Maqrizi's draft notebook was a great event. And as Baudin began to describe this manuscript, he realized that several of its pages Al-Maqrizi had constructed from discarded Mamluk chancery decrees. You can tell because of the characteristic wide line spacing, which also makes chancery decrees in Arabic vulnerable to reuse. So there were 3 land grants made by a single Mamluk sultan, Nasr Ahmed, who ruled for only 3 years, which is very useful for actually trying to locate this in time. How did Al-Maqrizi come to possess the decrees in the first place, let alone to repurpose them as cheap writing paper in his draft notebooks? Until 1389, Al-Maqrizi worked in the Mamluk chancery. Now, rest assured that he didn't walk away from the palace with official documents under his arm. I'll give you Baudin's explanation first, and then I'll tell you why I think it needs some rethinking. So Baudin notes that Al-Maqrizi, in one of his chronicles, describes a calamity that befell the archives of the Mamluk sultans at the citadel in Cairo. In 1389 or 1390, 791 of the Hijra, a group of emirs overthrew the reigning sultan and forced him from the palace. And Al-Maqrizi says many things were disordered. Among them was the matter of the chancery chamber at the citadel. It was abandoned, and the documents, awraq, literally the papers, in it were taken, sold by weight, and the records they contained forgotten. Okay, so what's just happened? A sultan is forced from Cairo, the palace enters a state of chaos, the keepers of the chancery are nowhere to be found, and documents from the chancery archive are emptied and sold by weight on the open market, presumably as scrap paper. So for Baudin, this is a one-time event. He assumes that it was after this coup d'etat that Al-Maqrizi bought his quire of land grants from a used paper seller. And the connections, the series of connections that he draws is so spectacularly ingenious that it's actually easy to overlook the fact that it rests on a tissue of presumptions, chief among which is that the decrees that Al-Maqrizi recycled were deacquisitioned forcibly and during the coup in question. What if they were actually deacquisitioned voluntarily and piecemeal over time, and not from the citadel in Cairo, but rather from a provincial bureau of government, for example, in the regions where the land grants were given and publicly announced? Any system of archiving requires not just the storage of documents, but also pruning them in the interests of order, relevance, and space management. In fact, reusing state documents for ordinary text was not a one-time event. It's a practice that goes back to the very dawn of Arabic chancery practice. An account of the education of the early Muslim jurist and legal theorist Ash-Shafi'i, who's the eponym of one of the 4 Sunni schools of law, notes that when he was educated at Mecca, there was a shortage of lightweight, flat writing supports, such as papyrus and parchment, and paper. It's not actually too early for paper at this point. So Ash-Shafi'i recorded the hadith that he was learning on one of 2 writing supports, either animal bones, probably shoulder blades, which allow for the largest surface, or else on the backs of official documents that had been discarded by the Abbasid state. So this tidbit of information is probably not a mere figment of the 9th, 10th, and 11th century authors who reported it. It needn't be taken on faith or remain adrift without an anchor in material reality, because Petra Seipenstein of the University of Leiden has discovered an 8th or 9th century Arabic hadith text of the very type that Ash-Shafi'i would have been writing, written on the back of a government document on papyrus. It's probably an Umayyad or an early Abbasid decree to judge by the script. So note the majuscule on the recto. Was there really a shortage that led people to reuse government documents? It's possible. But even without shortage, the recycling of state documents is a phenomenon that persisted for centuries. Naïm Fantichem of the Université Libre de Bruxelles, who was working as a postdoc for me last year, identified a fragment of an 11th century Fatimid decree on paper, on the back of which a Christian scholar had copied the 9th century Greek canon of Andreas of Crete. It's in terrible shape because it was recovered archaeologically, but nonetheless, Fantichem was able to identify it. By the 11th century, chanceries were universally using paper, a point to which I'll return shortly. Chanceries in the Islamic world, that is. But the phenomenon is also documented outside the Islamic world. The register of Giovanni Scriba, a 12th century notary of Genova, is composed in part of fragments of a bilingual Arabic-Latin decree from the Fatimid period, as well as some monolingual Fatimid decree fragments, which he's crossed out before writing his notarial register. Even outside the Islamic orbit, and this I owe to Susan Whitfield, some of the Chinese texts discovered at Dunhuang at the eastern end of the Silk Road were written on recycled government documents. So this is a decree. You can see the imprints of the seal of the king of Dunhuang, giving permission for the daughter of an official to enter a monastery. And we have a probable date for it. And on the back is a Buddhist dharani, which is an incantation text or an amulet for recitation, usually containing the sort of, meaning or substance of a chapter or a sutra. So you may be experiencing a certain degree of discomfort or possibly even horror at the idea that a notary or a Buddhist monk or, God forbid, a historian could press archival documents into service as scrap paper. I confess that I share this squirming discomfort, so let's drill into it and explore the presumptions that give rise to it. Is reuse necessarily a sign of contempt? We tend to fetishize the aura of our historical objects because from the perspective of mechanical and now electronic reproduction, we regard manuscripts as unica, as erratic, as somehow hapax. And we also intuitively regard the use of spolia as an exercise of power. Sorry about the slide, it's pure self-indulgence, but I couldn't resist. So to subsume a piece of writing material into a new text is a statement of the obsolescence of the old. This is what living empires do to dead ones. But does the reuse of state documents necessarily betray contempt for them, absence of the proper reverence due to an archive, or a lack of appreciation for written instruments? It may betray just the opposite of these things. The Cairo Geniza is by far the most abundant source we have of Arabic state documents. The Genizah was a storage chamber for disused texts in Hebrew script, although in the end it contained texts in many other scripts besides Hebrew. In Hebrew, you have not only the Hebrew language, but also Aramaic and Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic and Hebrew letters. The Genizah this is a iconic and famous picture of Solomon Schechter in 1897 in the Cambridge University Library, to which he transported about 200,000 texts from the Genizah, going through them. Clearly a staged photo, as all photos were in that era. The box that's actually closest to the viewer says bottles on it. There's an exhibition going on, just opened this week actually, at Cambridge on the Genizah, and they've done a sort of virtual reconstruction of the famous bottles box. They built this crate, and then they have some real Genizah fragments with no writing on them, and then some fake ones that they made to look like they're real Genizah fragments. It's kind of wonderful. The Genizah was found in the Ben Ezra synagogue, which was located in Fustat. Fustat was it's actually a city whose origins go back to Roman times. It was one of the major military garrisons during the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century. Eventually, it grew up into a pretty substantial urban nucleus. And in 973, when the Fatimids, who were Shiite rulers who had the audacity to proclaim themselves caliphs in 909 in North Africa, they came to Egypt in 969, and they didn't even conquer it. They just kind of waltzed in, and Egypt was desperate at that point to be delivered from Abbasid rule because the Abbasid capital at Baghdad was basically falling apart. And in fact, Egypt had started minting Fatimid coins a couple of decades before the Fatimid conquest. So when the Fatimids arrived in Egypt, they began building a Palatine city, and they called it the City Victorious, which in Arabic is a Medina al-Qahira, which is anglicized as Cairo. So Cairo and Fustat were two separate cities until about 1250. Would have taken about an hour and a half to walk between them. But by 1250, the urban nucleus of Fustat had extended northward and gradually came to englobe the city of Cairo. And by then also the citadel had been built by the Ayyubids. You can see it just south of Fatimid Cairo. So here's a map of Fustat, and you can see that it's still filled with Coptic churches. There's also the Coptic Museum. And if you go down this alley towards the Coptic Museum and you hang a left, you get to the Ben Ezra Synagogue compound. This shows it in a state of high refurbishment after 1991. And this is the interior, which is a wonderful example of late 19th century Egyptian craftsmanship because, in fact, the medieval synagogue doesn't exist anymore. The medieval synagogue was built sometime between 1025 and 1041. The roof collapsed in 1888, which was very bad for the synagogue and very good for historians because it revealed under the roof a huge chamber filled with 350,000 folios of text. The text would have been put into the chamber under the roof through a little portal that you would have to access via a ladder. So in the end, the contents of the Genizah over the course of the years between 1888 and 1910 were emptied and now are in somewhere between 60 and 70 libraries and private collections around the world. The vast majority are in Cambridge. The second biggest collection is at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, although at this very moment it's in Princeton on a 4-year loan because the JTS library is undergoing reconstruction, so I nabbed it for us temporarily. Most of the material in the Genizah dates to between 950 and 1250. There's very little that's earlier, with a couple of notable exceptions, like a papyrus codex, which is kind of amazing, probably 7th century. But the vast majority of the material dates from 950 and onward because of when the synagogue was built in the 1020s and 30s. So roughly 350,000 pages or fragments of pages. Numbers are a big problem because nobody's actually sat and counted, thank God. And I mean, you know, we all have a little bit of scholarly OCD, but that would be ridiculous. And also there's a methodological problem with counting, which is how do you count by folios? Is it 1 page or 2? So this is just to give you a kind of ballpark estimate. Another ballpark estimate, about 89% of the texts are what I call books in quotation marks, and I don't need to explain here why I'm putting books in quotation marks, because as you know, the medieval book could take many different physical forms, not just codices. Roughly 32,000 documents, letters, lists, quite literally grocery lists, prescriptions, legal documents of every conceivable variety, marriage contracts, bills of sale for real estate, for slaves, all kinds of absolutely fascinating texts that were never really meant to be preserved in perpetuity, meaning that the Genizah was not an archive. So archives contain living documents. They contain documents that are meant to be retrieved and that are meant to serve certain purposes in the real world, whereas Genizot contain dead writings of every conceivable variety, from literature to grocery lists. But paradoxically, although the Genizah was not an archive, it gives us a better idea of archiving practices than any archive ever could, because it's preserved evidence of the afterlives of documents and when and why they were deacquisitioned. The first 2 generations of scholars who worked on Genizah material were very excited about writing history from below. This was information of a type that was completely unknown before the decipherment of Genizah documents. Most Middle East history had been written, Middle East history before the Ottoman period had been written from chronicles emanating from the bureaucratic elite or the scholarly elite. So we knew very little about the economy and trade, about commodities, land tenure, women, slaves, non-Muslims. And as a result of now about a half a century of labor, because for the first 50 years that anyone worked on Genizah texts, they worked on the literary texts rather than the documents. But in the 1950s, there was kind of a documentary turn in the field, largely due to the labors of one man, S.D. Goitein. So I'm a student of Goitein. So as a result of this half century of labor, we know a lot about the Indian Ocean trade. So here's a wonderful letter from a Jewish trader in Aden in South Arabia to Abraham ibn Niju, who was in Mangalore on the southwestern coast of India for decades, and we have a huge amount of correspondence from him and the people he corresponded with, and you can see the commodities that are listed in this letter, but there's lots of other stuff in the letter besides. So we know lots about the Indian Ocean trade. We know a lot about food. It turns out that just as today Cairo is the perhaps international capital of home delivery for takeout food, so too in the Middle Ages, Cairo was a capital of takeout food. We know a lot about clothing. Mainly it was made out of flax. We know a lot about piety. People had less of it than you'd imagine. We know a lot about Jews living under Crusader rule, a lot more than you'd imagine, given that we didn't think there were any at all. And we know a lot about literacy rates, either more or less literacy than you'd think, depending on what you think. Complicated subject. But what this turn to social history didn't tell us much about is the state. The very courts of caliphs and sultans, so abundantly represented in the chronicles, have not yet made much of an appearance in scholarship on the Genizah, so people have simply assumed that the Genizah doesn't have much to say about the state. But it turns out that the state was under our noses the entire time, only people quite literally didn't see it. These are fragments of state decrees written in an Arabic chancery hand. By now you can actually recognize it, this large calligraphic Arabic with very wide line spacing. They're from 11th century Cairo, and I know this because the reuse of the text, the reuse for Hebrew script is in the hand of a known scribe who died in 1055. So the typical thing is that people would publish the Hebrew texts and say absolutely nothing about the Arabic ones, or else, this is my favorite thing, if you go to the 1906 catalog of the Bodleian Genizah collection, the Bodleian has about 12,500 Genizah fragments. Every time there is a fragment of a Fatimid state document, it's cataloged as, and I quote, scribbling. So it got to the point where every time I opened the catalog and saw the word scribbling, I got really excited because I knew I was finding another Fatimid state document. So this decree would have been written up in the chancery in Cairo by the official scribes of the Fatimid caliphs, and then written to be sent either to lower officials in the provinces, writing being one method of dealing with the technicalities of long-distance rule, or occasionally a decree would be issued to a group of petitioners. Often these recycled decrees have absolutely nothing to do with Jews, but they are nonetheless reused by Jewish scribes. So the question is, how did these Jewish scribes get their hands on Fatimid state decrees? I'm in the process of putting together a database, and right now I have more than 1,000 unpublished Fatimid and Ayyubid state documents. But until fragments of Fatimid decrees started surfacing in Genizah collections, only 10 of them were known. 9 of them were from the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai and are still there today. And one of them is from the archive of the Karaite Jewish community of Cairo. It's 8 meters long, so it's virtually impossible to really show you what it looks like on a slide. So I've just shown you a section in close-up. Almost all of these decrees are between 40 and 45 centimeters wide. They range in length from 3 meters to 8 or 10 meters long. This, I should just say, is a decree that I've been looking for about a decade, and I was in Cairo last month and I may have found it. There had been rumors that it had been smuggled out of Egypt, but actually it appears to still be there. I haven't seen it with my eyes, but I spoke to somebody who had, or who thought they saw something that looked like this, and it can only have been this. So medieval Arabic chancery decrees are instantly recognizable on several counts. They're extravagantly long, they're calligraphically written, their line spacing is impossibly broad, and there's a reason for this. All of this was an act of conspicuous consumption on the part of the state. My colleague Materiality calls this the customary display of the sovereign privilege of waste. So they're grand to look at, and they must have seemed impressive to those who listened to them being read aloud. They were not displayed, which is to say that there's no physical evidence that they were ever hung up publicly, but they would have fallen over the hands of whoever was reading them aloud and looked impressive nonetheless. And I think it's precisely this grandness, in part, that induces our sense of the aura or inviolability or incommensurability of these documents, because surely a text that could run to 8 meters is unique and special in some way. So would it not then have been archived? Weren't states in the business of preserving official documents to refer back to them later? To answer this question, it's important to know actually that there were 2 formats of decrees. There was the type of decree that was read aloud, which was the grand one with a wide line spacing. But if you were a provincial official and you were getting a good number of these decrees on a regular basis, and you decided you wanted to archive them in your office would end up looking like this. I know some of you probably do have offices that look like that, but you know, this happens to the best of us. So what the Fatimids very sensibly did is when they wanted to archive a decree, they copied it in a much more compact format, a bifolio. So this was a discovery of Geoffrey Kahn of Cambridge University, and it was really, I mean, I would never have known what I was looking at, in addition to which the Arabic paleography is not for the faint of heart. It's a copy of a decree from the Fatimid archives, and we know that it's a copy for a couple of reasons, which I'll get to in a second. We know that it was archived because when you peer into the gutter here, you find 4 pinholes at regular intervals, which shows that it was actually bound into a quire, which is an archiving method that goes back to the Sasanians. So here there's a great big scrawl at the top of the page. So first of all, it says it's a Manshur Karim, it's a noble decree, at the top of which there was an alama, the cipher signature of the caliph, and we don't see the cipher signature here, so we know that it was a copy, and then it says that it was a copy. And then in addition to saying that it was a copy, there's that great big slash that you see down the page, right? Which even if you are an excellent Arabic paleographer, you may have some trouble reading, because in fact, it took my field 35 years to decipher that one word. But it turns out that that one word says nuqila, it was copied. So this says this is a gracious decree which has been authenticated at its top in the pure noble hand, and the authentication mark reads, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, praise be to God, Lord of the worlds, which was the typical sort of pious phrase that the caliphs would sign as authentication marks on official documents. Lower officials signed with other pious phrases. So the Fatimids did not, in fact, archive the grand rotuli that were read aloud. The grandeur was performative, the performance was fleeting, and there was no reason to keep these great big rotuli around after the performance was over. So why not destroy the decrees completely? Wouldn't they have contained sensitive information? It turns out, there's Nuqila, that in almost every instance that I found of these reused decrees, what you're looking at, in fact, is not a whole line of text, but half a line of text. So it seems that what they did was to cut the decrees in half vertically, so that all you would be left with is either the right side or the left side of the lines, but not a whole line, which would stymie the efforts of people who wanted to reconstruct them, including me, by the way. So let me give you an example of how this worked. Let me zoom in a little bit on one particular example. This is like an unbelievable thing that happened. So I was in Oxford in 2011 with a group of scholars. We were all working on material aspects of Genizah texts. And there was a young scholar from Jerusalem named Ronnie Shweka who was looking for a particular text called the She'il Tot, which is a very interesting Iraqi, 8th century Iraqi Jewish text in a sort of classic rabbinic combination of Hebrew and Aramaic. It's a sermonic text, so it contains basically legal homilies or homilies on legal sections of the Bible. And we know who wrote it. It's by a fellow named Achai of Shabcha, who is Iraqi. He was looking for text of this because the text had survived in 2 recensions. One of them French, the other Italian, probably neither French or Italian, but that's where the manuscripts were found. And he wanted to find out what the text of the She'il Tot was closer to home when it circulated in the Middle East. Somebody had told him the She'il Tot is a closed book, don't even bother. He went into Genizah collections and found 120 fragments of the She'il Tot, some of which he was actually able to piece together into larger manuscripts, including this one. So this is 7 fragments, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there's a 7th somewhere, of the She'il Tot written in vertical format, in rotulus format, which I'll explain in a second. The fragments are now in 3 libraries on 2 continents. And on the back is a Fatimid decree, which I never would have been able to piece together because there's simply too much blank space. But through the mere matter of textual density, Ronnie Shweka made this absolutely staggering join. He actually found the bottom the bottom 6 fragments. And then we published, Ronnie and I and Judith Elshobi-Schlanger from the École Pratique des Hautes Études, we published a little article on the website of the Cambridge University Library Genizah unit announcing the discovery of this thing. And a couple months later, we got an email from a graduate student in Frankfurt saying, I found another fragment of it. And it was the top fragment. And the thing that was great about the top fragment is that it contained a smoking gun. And the smoking gun, so this is the very, very, very top. You can barely see it. This is what it looks like close up, which you can still barely see. But it's pretty clear in Hebrew that it says Shabbat Breshit, which means the first Sabbath of the liturgical cycle where you read the opening of the book of Genesis. So what does this mean? This copy of the Sheiltot is crazy, which is to say it doesn't fit in with either the French or the Italian recensions. There are paragraphs that are out of order, there's material that's not represented in other manuscripts, and Ronnie couldn't figure out what was going on. He said, my God, there must have been a very, very different version of the Sheiltot that was circulating in the East. But then we started paying attention to the material aspects of the manuscripts, and there were two things that called our attention. One is that it's not written in codex form, it's written in rotulus form. Judith Olshobi-Schlanger from the Code Pratique calls the rotulus the third form of the Hebrew book in the Middle Ages. So you've all done some studying this year, I understand, of the transition from roll book to codex. It used to be thought that the rotulus, the vertical scroll, was a transitional form that the Jews used in between when they used the roll book in antiquity, the horizontal roll book, and when they finally went over to the codex after the Islamic conquest. But it turns out it's not true. In fact, Jews used all three formats of books simultaneously, but they used them for different purposes. So horizontal roll books were used for liturgical purposes, so Torah scrolls, and also Megillot, like the Book of Esther, would be read in synagogue from horizontal scrolls. The codex was the format that you used if you wanted to copy a book for circulation. But if you wanted a book that was strictly for your own use, or a set of notes on a book, or if you wanted to alter the text of a book because, let's say, you were desperate for sermonic material, you would do it in the form of a rotulus. So a rotulus was kind of like a private copy. It's actually quite interesting because it's a sort of remnant of the culture of the oral and the written in late antiquity, where the hypomnema was a sort of private set of notes, and then the syngramma was the official version of a text. So the Hellenistic distinction between the official text and the private text is something that the Jews still observed in the Middle Ages, and the way they made the distinction was by writing these private texts as rotuli. So that was the discovery of Judith Olshobi-Schlanger. Then we found this smoking gun, and we said, aha, okay, so this guy is clearly desperate for sermonic material for the first Sabbath of the liturgical year. So what does he do? He takes a book off the shelf, he goes into the Sheiltot, and he says, I'm going to copy some material from here. But it doesn't matter what order he copies it in, because he's just going to be giving it over orally anyway. This is kind of his version. So this is not actually a recension of the text. Very important that philologists pay attention to the material form of the manuscript witnesses they're looking at. This is not a recension, it's a performance, right? It's a single one-off performance of a text that can't be taken into account in making a critical edition. Now, even better, it turns out we actually know who copied the text. This is Ephraim ben Shmaria. He has a instantly recognizable Hebrew hand. It's not a particularly nice hand, but luckily for us, it's very unusual. He's not one of the many, many scribes who tried to write in a stereotyped way so that you can't actually identify them. He has a totally distinctive Hebrew script, also a totally distinctive Arabic script, which I may have identified, which is really exciting. And he's an important guy because he was the head of the congregation that prayed in the Ben Ezra synagogue where the Genizah was found from sometime in the 1020s until 1055, which means that we now have a terminus. We can date the Fatimid decree to sometime before 1055. And that is also significant because it means that this Fatimid decree was not something that was, say, ransacked by Saladin, the first Ayyubid Sultan, when he toppled the Fatimid Caliphate in 1171, but rather that was deacquisitioned voluntarily. It's also interesting, and I haven't quite thought through the implications of this yet, that I was telling you that I think that these great big decrees are basically done for the purpose of performance, and that the rotulus of Ephraim ben Shmaria is also done for the purpose of performance. So the question is how conscious it was when Ephraim ben Shmaria gets his reused Fatimid decree, what he's going to use it for. I mean, clearly he needed a rotulus, right? But how deliberate is it that he used this particular kind of rotulus? All right, let me throw in a few more A few more details, and then I'll tell you what I think it all adds up to. Okay, so we have a Fatimid decree, we have Ephraim ben Shmariah reusing it for his own purposes. So what was considered an appropriate amount of time to wait before a document could go into circulation as writing paper? We know that this decree was written sometime after 969, probably even later than that, to judge by other specimens that I've seen. So we're talking about a matter of only a couple of decades. So what was the appropriate amount of time to wait before a document became, in the words of a piece of medieval Jewish Aramaic legal formulary, like a potsherd in the marketplace with no real value, or a dead letter? Tamer-Alethi, whom I quoted earlier, has brought to my attention a passage from the Cairene jurist Ibn al-Hajj al-Abdari from the Mamluk period, right around the time of Makrizi, a little bit earlier, so he would have been a teenager during the coup d'etat that may or may not have liberated the scrap decrees that al-Makrizi reused for his notebook. In his Introduction to Islamic Jurisprudence, Ibn al-Hajj warns paper sellers and bookbinders about used paper, al-waraq al-maktub, literally paper that has already been written on. And he cautions them on two counts. Alethi describes this as an act of compulsively pious moral regulation. This is all to make you want to read Tamer-Alethi's works, because he has the perfect phrase for everything. In order to avoid the prohibition on defiling sacred texts, Ibn al-Hajj says, scribes should reuse receipts and account books. And in order not to infringe on anyone's right, haq is the word in Arabic, they should make sure that the receipts contained in them have already expired. This is hardly the only time that the word haq appears in the sense of rights in these texts. So in case you still suspected that the Oriental despotism thesis had something to recommend it. In a world in which recycling would have been the norm, because this is a handmade world, what needed to be regulated was not the use of new versus used paper, because everyone used paper, but rather the difference between live and dead letters, documents that conferred rights and documents that no longer conferred rights. There was, in other words, a sophisticated concept of the archive and its capacity to confer rights, contrary to the quotation from Chamberlain that I read you at the beginning of the lecture. Once a text had done its business, it was stored in the central archives in Cairo, but it was stored in one place only. It didn't need to be stored in many places. So which one was stored, the original or the copy? Or rather, which was which? Which was the original and which was the copy? Well, the strange thing is that they both call themselves copy. So here we have something clearly calling itself a copy, the bifolio that would have been archived. And here we have the great grand 8-meter rotulus that says it has been copied in the chancery, and then there's another authentication mark in the form of a pious phrase. So are they all copies, perhaps of some Platonic ideal, which is the utterance of the caliph? This is what an idea I was playing with until via my colleague Sally Poor at Princeton, who was in a lecture at the Medieval Academy a couple of weeks ago and saw this slide, which I then tracked down in a manuscript in Edinburgh. I started to have different ideas. So this is Rashid ad-Din. It's a 14th century manuscript of a universal history. So going from the ancient Persian kings all the way up until the Seljuk sultans. And what we have here is a Seljuk Sultan pictured with his retinue, including what presumably is the head of his chancery, wearing a turban and copying a long rotulus with wide line spacing, presumably a decree. And what's in front of him are, first of all, his pen case. And you can see lots of pen cases that look like that in museums around the world. The Victorian Albert has some really nice ones. And then there's also some smaller sheets of paper with strings. So it's not completely clear what these are. To me, this looks like these could be edges of pages. So perhaps what this is a quire of bifolia of the type that would have been bound into an archive. And here are the strings that would have bound it. Now, I don't want to make too much of this because I just don't know how skilled this painter was, because I know very little about medieval Middle Eastern painting. But if you look where his eye is pointing, to me it looks like he is copying this from this, right? He's copying the great big rotulus from the bifolio. But that's just a hypothesis, and I'd be eager to hear your opinion about it. So whatever was copied from what, are the material manifestations of this kind of Platonic caliphal utterance that then has different physical forms, are the material manifestations of it just kind of ephemeral garbage to be thrown away? On the contrary, they're more precious for having existed once and no longer existing later. So it's a kind of, like the image that I have in mind now is a kind of sovereign potlatch, like an opulent ritual where possessions are given away or destroyed to display the wealth of the state or enhance its prestige. Or perhaps, if you want a more sublunary metaphor, like Pete Townsend and Keith Moon at the end of Who concerts in the 1960s, an act of premeditated destruction of the instruments of performance. Or maybe like medieval Snapchat. In her study of host presses, Aidan Kumler explores what she calls Eucharistic morphology or ontology. This is going to seem like a completely Looney Tunes analogy, but stay with me. Aidan Kumler says, we have to start by describing objects designed for destruction, objects that as a class no longer exist. The Eucharistic host or wafer was never made for permanent preservation. It was instead an object that invited conspicuous consumption, quite literally. Placed directly in the communicant's mouth during the High and later Middle Ages, the wafers that invited close visual scrutiny in art of the period were things to be eaten carefully. So Kumler here is following Brigitte Bedos-Rezac, who links the wax seal and the embossed coin, all items in a series, together. And to these, Kumler adds the pressed host. This is kind of like the revenge of the Hilfswissenschaften in the age of material culture studies. Like, it used to be that people who did sigillography and numismatics were kind of like the, librarian moles that nobody liked to, integrate into the historical profession. But now all this stuff is coming front and center, which is excellent because material culture is something that people are studying more and more. So Kumler says that each of these was produced by a process of impression and incarnated the presence and authority of its human referent. So in the case of the seal, the sender or the signer of a letter is what's being incarnated. In the case of a coin, it's the sovereign who is the arbiter and the guarantor of economic value. And in the case of the host, it's the body of Christ. At the same time, each of these was reproduced mechanically in a series, so they're not unica. And in this system of signification, what you have is either a fungible signifier or a vanishing one. Each coin and seal is like the other coins and seals, and hosts too are identical. But in the case of the host, the signifier is imminent and it's destined for ingestion and for dematerialization, while the signified is transcendent and already immaterial. So I want to argue that something like this may be happening with the Arabic decree, that the word of the caliph in Ismaili Shiite theology, and the Fatimids were Ismailis, the word of the caliph was law. And the requirements of the storage capacity of the state on a much more prosaic level would have been handled by the compact bifolio. But the avatar of the sovereign as lawgiver was destined for destruction. And there may be a lesson in this for us as historians, that codices are meant to last while documents are quite literally ephemera. And as historians, we have to remember this, that much as we fetishize our beautiful documents as authentic, in fact, the entire science of diplomatics is founded on an understanding of what's authentic and what isn't, our medieval subjects didn't necessarily see things the same way. Some documents were meant for posterity and archives, and others were vanishing signifiers. Officials placed authentication marks on documents to demonstrate their having come from government offices and having been copied and registered. They were marks of authenticity, and they gave the document its attributed value. But in its rotulus form, the value a document had was a performance value, not an archival value. And that is why you have two performances, one on the back of the other. One more large piece of the puzzle to help us understand the value, the theory of value and of signification that underlies the medieval Arabic Chancery decree. What we have to pay attention to is its materiality by asking how its contemporaries would have seen paper. Those who work with European manuscripts tend to think of parchment as a more luxurious support than paper. Why wouldn't a decree that was meant to look and sound impressive be written on a more impressive and durable support? And if you're asking yourself this, you wouldn't be alone, although here, I gather, is one of the few places in the world where we have lots and lots more respect for paper, maybe. So paper as a writing material for state documents provoked a deep mistrust in rulers in medieval southern Europe. Roger II of Sicily regarded the use of paper for official text with such suspicion that in 1137 he ordered charters written on it to be recopied onto parchment and the originals destroyed. which is particularly striking given that in everything else he did, Roger II slavishly imitated the Fatimids in his architecture, in his use of a sovereign tribunal to hear petitions, and in his production of documents in Arabic, as Jeremy Johns has masterfully shown. In 1231, Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, similarly banned paper for records of state in Naples, Sorrento, and Amalfi. Now, both of these rulers' domains were rich with sheep and other parchment-yielding livestock, so banning paper was a luxury that they could afford. But supply and demand itself are never adequate as explanations for technological change. You also have to pay attention to context, to convention, and to local semiotics. During the Arab conquest of Central Asia, paper came to assume an indelible prestige precisely because of its association with sovereign administration. So while in Europe paper was suspect because it was ephemeral, in the medieval Islamic world paper had the pedigree of the imperium. It was a medium associated with rule over vast territories. The Abbasids, as you all know, began manufacturing paper within the first half century of their rule, probably by about 800. Now, you've all heard the story of the prisoner of war the Chinese prisoner of war taken captive by the Abbasids at the Battle of Talas in 751. And there's been lots of debate about how, quote unquote, true this really is. There's a fragmentary memoir of an actual prisoner of war under the Abbasids that suggests that maybe this really happened. But it certainly wasn't the first time that the Arabs used paper. That we know for a fact because of archaeological finds. Paper was in fact circulating among local Central Asian sources, and this is where the Arabs got it from. One of the main places where you could find paper was in Sogdiana, a small mercantile state with a vast reach across the Asian continent. Now, there may have been other sources of Central Asian paper that the Arabs encountered. I don't know about them, and I'd be eager to hear if anyone else does. When the Umayyads conquered Samarkand, it was the capital of the Sogdians. Sogdian is a Persian language written in an Aramaic-derived script, which itself is a significant fact because it attests to the Sogdians' cosmopolitanism. Aramaic had been the administrative language of the Achaemenid Empire in Central and West Asia, so the Sogdians were very much carrying on Achaemenid writing traditions. The Sogdians excelled in monetized exchange, and they utilized sophisticated financial instruments to the point where in the Central Asian imaginary, Sogdian was inextricably bound up with monetary transactions. So the old Turkic word for debt comes from Sogdian, and the Uyghur word for coin also comes from Sogdian. So the Sogdians are classic vectors of diffusion. They had a huge reach across the northern Silk Road of more than 3,000 kilometers. Now, cosmopolitanism can be a blessing and a curse in a society with a rural hinterland, which is to say almost any society. The Sogdians' link to trade and money and writing provoked some classic anti-mercantile prejudices. A 7th century monk named Xuanzang, who was immortalized in Buddhist legend and Chinese epic for going to India in search of better versions of Buddhist sutras, translating them, bringing them back to China, and eventually being transformed in legend from a monk into a monkey with a magical pin tucked behind his ear. Has anyone here read Journey to the West? This 4-volume, Chinese epic from the 16th century about this monk going to India to get better versions of Buddhist texts. So I had a crazy English teacher, senior year of high school, who had us read the entire thing. Not in Chinese, though. So this man is reported to have called the Sogdians slippery and tricky. He may have needed to study those sutras a little harder. A 10th century Tang history likewise reported that the future Sogdian trader as a baby is inculcated with mercantile values when his parents put honey on his mouth and place glue in his palms so that when he grows up he will speak sweet words and grasp coins in his hands as if they were glued there. So to be crudely comparative about it, the Sogdians were to early medieval Asia what the Jews were to medieval Christian Europe. They were seen as networked, cosmopolitan, peripatetic, mercantile, and adept in the technical skills required for handling currency, and they were reviled by everyone else as untrustworthy and greedy. The anxieties of the non-monetized aside, if travel, trade, and maintaining caravan networks of the vast continent of Asia requires bookkeeping and administrative skill, it also requires sustainable writing supports. The earliest evidence of paper that I know of outside of the Chinese orbit is a group of 8 letters written in Sogdian that were found in 1907 in a ruined watchtower in the system of Chinese frontier walls 90 kilometers west of Dunhuang. They date to the early 4th century. Many of you probably know these, the Sogdian ancient letters. They were sent by Sogdian merchants and their wives from northwestern China, 3,000 kilometers west to Samarkand, but they got lost on the way, unfortunately for them and fortunately for posterity, in the Taklamakan Desert, which is the driest place on Earth. So the intersection of human civilization with the desert often works magic for historians who are in search of ancient texts. These Sogdians' letters are written on paper. The Umayyads also had access to Sogdian paper decades before the Battle of Talas. Umayyad paper fragments have been found recently in joint German, Tajik, Swiss excavations in historic Sogdia. These are the earliest Arabic documents written on paper. They're from the early 8th century, and they demonstrate that the Arabs knew paper at least 2 decades before the Battle of Talas. There's also a not-so-recent find that's been overlooked in discussions of Arab paper. Excavations by Soviet archaeologists, this is Parchment, by the way, excavations by Soviet archaeologists in Tajikistan in 1931 discovered the remnants of the archive of the last Sogdian king when he was a vassal of the Umayyads in the 720s. So this is a petition that he wrote to his Arab overlords in Arabic, and it's written on parchment, clearly written by a bilingual Sogdian Arabic scribe. The Arabs also wrote a letter to this Sogdian king, and they wrote it as they would have in Sogdian, and they wrote it on paper. So both of these documents, this is a sort of testament to diplomatic exchange. Both of these documents would have been written by bilingual scribes, but each of these documents was written in the diplomatic conventions of the recipient of the letter as a sign of respect. So when you were writing to an Arab emir, you wrote on parchment, which was the material of choice for the Arabs before they adopted paper. And when you were writing to a Sogdian king, you would write on paper. So it may well be that paper was a kind of status material for the Sogdians, although there are also other Sogdian documents on parchment, mainly legal documents. But I looked through the published archive of this king of Sogdiana, and almost all the letters that he sent are actually written on paper. There's also lots of low-class materials that you find in the Sogdian archive: willow sticks, juniper boards, and ostraca. So paper seems to have had a certain prestige for the Sogdians. Now, early on, the Umayyad and Abbasid administrations would use any writing material that they could get their hands on, including parchment, leather, and papyrus. And when they eventually adopted paper, what we're told, first of all by Ibn Khaldun in the 14th century, so much, much later, is that paper technology was adopted in the Abbasid chancery because of its resistance to erasure, tampering, and forgery. You can palimpsest parchment and papyrus, but you can't palimpsest paper. The idea that the Abbasids introduced paper for its tamper resistance is also reported by 2 other sources. And significantly, like Ibn Khaldun, both of them had worked as chancery officials. Al-Qalqashandi was head of the Mamluk chancery, and to come full circle, al-Maqrizi was appointed to the Mamluk chancery the year after Al-Qalqashandi stepped down from it. All of these authors, as Muslim chancery officials for whom paper was still a medium of prestige for state documents, probably felt like they had to defend the medium in response to its bad press in Latin Europe. In their world, paper had been established for 6 centuries as a medium of state administration, and surely this fact deserved an explanation. History books continue to cite paper's economy and imperviousness to tampering as the reasons that the Abbasids preferred it to parchment and papyrus, and they continue to cite the Chinese as its vector of diffusion. But explanations from convenience and proximity in social scientific terms are technological determinist and rational choice arguments, and they should fail to convince us by themselves. As with any instance of innovation diffusion, questions of prestige must come into play. The Sogdians knew something about administration over vast territory from which the Arabs might have wished to learn. Then the Abbasids took on paper, they began to manufacture it. Eventually their chancery practice completely changed with the use of paper. The format of their documents became grand, the script became calligraphic, and the layout became quite wasteful. So that by the time the Fatimids conquered Egypt, paper had acquired the prestige of government. Now, one last tiny piece and then I'll conclude. Was there, in fact, a shortage of paper in the Fatimid realm such that people would have been moved to use anything they could get their hands on? If you read through Goitein's Mediterranean Society, you find lots of quotations about shortages of paper. I tracked every single one of these quotations down to the original documents from which they come, and they're all from India. So yes, there was a shortage of paper, but there was a shortage of paper in India. So you have people, traders like Abraham ibn Yiju in Mangalore, writing to Egypt and saying, please send me some paper, I need some paper. But otherwise, paper seems to be in conspicuous abundance, and you have lots of different types of it. You have Andalusi paper. Now, I should preface this by saying these types of paper are mentioned, but we have absolutely no idea what they were or what they looked like. So here we have somebody saying, my lord mentioned buying paper from this guy or someone else. I haven't found Andalusi paper in sufficient quantities, since my lord mentioned that he needed it to copy a book. This guy, Musa ibn Abi Hay, by his nickname here, has only small quantities of Andalusi paper, but he has Shami paper, Syrian paper, wide and large, for 8 dinars per ream. If it pleases my lord, I will acquire some for him. We have Egyptian paper, which seems to be a bit cheaper. We have Shami paper, which was mentioned in the previous letter, and here it's paper with a particular, from a particular manufacturer with his trademark on it, not yet a watermark. There's white paper, bayad, which seems to have come from Al-Andalus, so it may have been the same as Andalusi paper, and indeed when you find letters written from Al-Andalus, the paper is very bright and white. And then you have government paper. So for example, I also sent you 2 bundles of large fine paper, government paper, the likes of which no one has, meaning it's supposed to be some very, very special stuff. And then there's a paper called talhi paper, which is, in my opinion, the most interesting of all. I sent you a package with 3 bundles of Egyptian talhi paper of the best obtainable quality. This is also from an India trade letter. Because the name talhi paper, Karad Talhi, comes from Talha ibn Tahir, who was an emir of Khurasan, which is the same area where paper had been manufactured before the Abbasids conquered it around the time of the Battle of Talas. So there's a long history of paper being associated with government in the Arab world, and that, in fact, I think explains its prestige. It explains why it had the prestige of government attached to it, and it also explains why between 900 and 940, paper very rapidly, completely supplanted papyrus in Egypt as the medium of choice, despite the fact that papyrus had been used for literally millennia. So why were government decrees under the Fatimids, Ayyubids, and Mamluks discarded, dismembered, and reused as scrap paper? The question should not be resolved by assuming that there was a shortage of writing materials. Picture of Goitain. Misplaced, sorry. Nor should one assume that these societies had no regard for documents or archives. There's a difference between a regime's production of documents, its use of archives, and the capacity of those archives to outlast it. But those distinctions are not always recognized, as though a polity that has failed to store written instruments in perpetuity has also put little stock in their utility to begin with. The Islamic Middle East from the Umayyads onward possessed a long and remarkably coherent administrative tradition, and none of this should surprise us in a region that invented writing, state documentation, and archiving as we know it. The region also possessed sophisticated methods of archiving, and as in any archival culture, those methods were a mix of storage and pruning. But to say that archives were pruned is not enough. You also have to ask about the logic of archival practices. The discarding of the grand, lavish rotuli was a form of conspicuous consumption, of destruction as a sign of government prestige. Paper may be mere rags, but it was made to substitute, or plant material, but it was made to substitute for the presence of the caliph through the intermediary of chancery script. There was a poverty of material combined with a transcendence of referent, no less than in seals, which are mere wax and clay, or hosts, which are mere flour and water. And just as seals substituted for the presence of the writer and hosts for the body of Christ, decrees were signifiers of the imam, all of which suggests not a poverty of documentary culture, but a sophistication that we've only begun to understand. Thank you. Yes.
I'll just speak into the mic because it's.
Are you going to field it? Okay, good.
This was wonderful, and I didn't know about the, as a medievalist, about the Sicilian rulers' contempt for paper. I do remember reading in Leonard Boyle's Guide to the Vatican Archives that the papacy was starting to use paper in the 11th century, but I've only worked in those archives once and was looking at much later materials. So And there certainly was paper being produced in Spain, as your documents make reference to. So it might have to do with regional politics also.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a very, very interesting question, especially, I mean, I know much more about the Normans than I do about Frederick II, mainly because of Jeremy Johns and his research on them. And the question of the extent to which, especially Roger II, imitated the Fatimids and the Byzantines and then also resisted seeming exactly like the Fatimids and the Byzantines is a very interesting one. So I think that's right. There might have been some kind of dialectic there of both imitation and resistance. And just one thing on, we know that paper was manufactured in Al-Andalus, but in Christian Spain it would actually take much longer, I think 13th century, is that right? And I'd be very curious to see something from the papal chancery from the 11th century on paper. I wonder if that's right.
Marina, is it possible to go back to the image of the head of the chancery with the turban on who was copying the long?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and the close-up. This is really interesting to me because it seems to me there's quite a bit of detail. This artist is really, just the facial detail and so on. And the fact that he's gone to the trouble to show the pages of the smaller book with a cord going through it. I had two questions about this long form copying going on. First of all, it looks like it might be twice as wide and folded. And you get the writing going right to the edge in all of your examples, and even here the writing seems to be going right to the edge. And I'm just wondering if there's something going on with.
You're saying this looks like it's folded?
Yeah, folded on the right, or the fold looks like it's on the right. I don't know how accurate that is, but the writing goes right to the very edge.
Yeah.
Is that the direction he would actually be writing, or would he have oriented this 90 degrees and written?
So,
well, I just found this curious. I guess if I had one specific question, it would be, you said something earlier about when you find these documents, they appear to be half. The writing goes right up to the edge. Well, why? What happened to the other half?
right.
Do you sometimes find the other half, or is there something going on here with? Is the other half of it some additional writing, and you purposely divide it as proof that it was written at such and such a time? I don't know. I think this is just a really intriguing image.
Yeah, I also don't know quite what to make of it. So, I've never found the other half, but you have to understand that I also have hundreds and hundreds of fragments, and I tried desperately to piece them together. I found about 14 joins among 1,000 fragments, so it's it's quite desperate. But okay, so a couple of things. First of all, I hadn't noticed the possibility that this is folded. He's also got a big schmear here, so who knows how intentional this double line is. I don't know.
Right.
And there's also some kind of ghosting, or I don't know,
Right.
pentimento here. The angle of writing, I don't know if this is exactly what you're asking about, but it's a very interesting question. And Jeffrey Kahn came to Princeton a couple of weeks ago, and he and George Kiraz, who works on Syriac, had a really interesting discussion in seminar about the angle at which scribes would have held the paper when they wrote. And apparently this kind of 90 degrees off was quite typical for the period, and you see it in lots and lots of illustrations. It's also typical that they're writing on their knee and not on a surface. The margins bother me too, because in general with the decrees, the right-hand margin, I have problems with right and left, the right-hand margin for you is quite wide. And the left-hand margin is actually almost non-existent. And that's where you get stacking of words at the ends of lines. Some people have said that that's an anti-forgery mechanism, so you can't squeeze in any more words. But the truth is, if you're stacking words at the ends of lines and they're kind of curving upward, you can actually fit in a couple more. I think it's just a convention, and it's a convention that arose specifically in the late 10th century after the adoption of paper. The smooth surface of paper seems to have sort of liberated the hand across the page. I have like a whole thing on, I think it's in the chapters that I sent for the seminar this afternoon, on how writing Arabic on papyrus and writing Arabic on paper require two very different kinds of hand movements, and you can actually see it reflected in the different scripts. So, you know, I don't really know how much weight to put on the details here, but I agree that this business and the strings and stuff, it's really quite striking. I mean, I'd be curious for other people's thoughts on it.
Hi, thanks. So it's very interesting. I was wondering, I didn't quite understand why did the users of these garment fragments they could have erased it themselves. You can see why they wouldn't bother to erase it, the ones who sold it, right? Why didn't they not erase it when they were using it?
I actually have an example of a decree that the user attempted to erase. I wish I had brought it to show you. It didn't go very well. The thing with this rag paper is that if you try to take the ink off the surface, you also destroy the surface of the paper.
But I mean, all this stuff we looked at were
No. So
everything we've been looking at is
this is all paper. Paper, yeah. That's paper. Sorry, that's paper, even though it looks a bit shiny, but it's paper. The only parchment I've shown you is that Sogdian letter. So let me just go back to some slides here and you can look at it again. Now, in the full knowledge that in fact, you're looking at paper. Yeah, all this is paper. So this is actually an interesting case which doesn't quite fit in. You see the whole lines here. And by the way, here you also see the great big right-hand margin and not much of a left-hand margin. So it's not that you find them vertically sliced in half in every single case, but it's consistent enough that it, I think, requires some commentary. So yeah, there were attempts at erasure and they weren't very successful.
Going back to that photo, if we could, of the copyist,
Yep.
which blows my mind on a couple of levels. First, I had no idea that, at least in the Middle East, they had an archival practice of making quires out of documents. And I wonder also the using a string, at least I guess only through a single hole, to bind documents. Or is there any material evidence for that in the Cairo Geniza? I mean, do you see holes for strings? Or, I mean, it seems almost like a Pothi's style book. Which,
Oh, what style book?
The palm leaf manuscripts
Right.
with, usually with one or two holes in the East. I just wonder, I mean, it seems so foreign to anything that I thought existed in the Mediterranean. That
I mean, that's a good question. Where exactly is this string going? Where is it attaching? It does not appear to be in the margins. It appears to be going through the center of the page, doesn't it? And yeah, that is much more like the palm leaf practice. Like I said, this is really my first foray into Central Asia.
Sure.
And I'm a little bit disoriented, but completely intrigued and fascinated. I have like this stack of books on my desk that I've been going through, and it's completely blowing my mind. So I hope that maybe one of you can say something about this. But I will say that in terms of practice, the practice is reflected in the Genizah. It is absolutely consistent that this happens even in the legal courts, even in rabbinical courts, so that Jewish scribes in courts, when they are giving a document of testimony to one of the litigants in a case, it's a single sheet of paper. But when they take notes to keep in the court register, it's always a bifolio. And it's a bifolio of almost the same size as the government bifolia. So I found lots and lots of these government bifolios. Most of them are fiscal documents. Not all of them have the pinholes in the margin that copy of the Fatimid decree has. So binding, I mean, we have a whole passage in Al-Qalqashandi, this Mamluk chancery official, who says that when the chancery official gathers together all of the registers for a particular month, he puts them into a And the word shak, it can mean like a folder, or it can mean a binder, or it can mean a quire. It's not exactly clear what it means. So there seems to have been both practices where you would kind of put things into a folder and then you would actually bind some of them together. And I don't think it was terribly consistent. But the size of the registers, the bifolio registers, is shockingly consistent.
Thank you. And one other quick mundane question. You showed the various types of paper that are mentioned in the Genizah documents, and one of those, which was particularly sought after, I think was called the governmental paper.
Yes.
Is it possible that that's referring to these Fatimid state documents and simply very high quality paper because of what it was intended for and was sought after?
It is possible. I also sent you 2 bundles of large, fine paper. Government paper, waraq sultani, spelled wrong, which they often do, the like of which no one has, i.e., like I have.
Right.
Not no one. Right. I assume that he's talking about unused government paper.
Okay.
And that one of the reasons that it's sought after is the large format. So the only whole decrees that we have are the 10 that I mentioned earlier, 9 of which were preserved, are still in the Monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai, and one of which is from the Karaite synagogue. I have photographs of some of these, and I've studied them and tried to measure actually where the colices are. And it seems that these pieces of paper, in addition to being 45 centimeters wide, are 1 meter long. Sometimes you find paper that's that long in the Genizah. I mean, I showed you some of these India trade letters, which are quite lengthy, and I actually haven't examined them for colices. But I think that the government papers were particularly large format, and that may have been one of the reasons they were sought after. But you know, that having been said, I had this conversation with Tim when we first met. Nobody has actually studied the paper of the Genizah. I mean, nobody's held it up to a light box. Nobody's tried to figure out, you know, about the fibers and stuff like that, the different qualities. I mean, it's a vast unknown. So, you know, I'd be happy to teach you how to do it if you want to.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes. Eric?
I have a question about the rotulus, the rotulus image. The various, yeah, maybe you should get it up first.
You're talking about the one that's written recto verso?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
No. Yes, this one. They have different colors, and presumably originally it was all the same color.
Yes.
So I was wondering, is this the digital photography, or is this preservation modern, or is this when it went in the Genizah that somehow things got discolored when they were in certain positions of the room? Maybe you can shed some light on that.
I've asked myself the same question, and I don't know the answer. One of the beauties of the modern age is that you can see this document as its scribe saw it, but you can't ever do that in physical reality because the librarians would never let you. So it's quite literally impossible to compare with the naked eye right next to each other, Cambridge, New York, and Manchester documents. I can tell you that every time I see a New York document, an ENA document from the JTS, I immediately recognize it as an ENA document because of the color. Now, is that because of the way they were photographed? I don't think so. I think it probably has to do with storage methods. The Elkan Nathan Adler collection was a private collection until 1923, and at that point it was given, or sold actually, to the Jewish Theological Seminary. And it seems to have been collected piecemeal from lots and lots of different places in the Middle East. So why would it all have this kind of similar brownish cast? Is it because of how Adler was storing them? Is it because of how the seminary was storing them? I just don't know. And ditto for the digital photography. I assume that on a technical level there is some way of answering this question, but I don't know how.
Okay, but in a sense then, this might be a very nice case for studying how things deteriorate over time in our modern age. It's very interesting. Thank
Absolutely, or how paper discolors.
you. Yes.
I mean, the thing is that you would have to then reconstruct very carefully the provenance of every one of these fragments. And often it's actually not very easy to do that. So the easiest case of provenance is Cambridge, because Solomon Schechter went to Cairo in 1896, and in 1897 he came back with crates and crates of Genizah manuscripts, about 200,000 pages, which is what was left over when the dealers and the private collectors had had their way with the stuff between 1888 and 1896. Between 1888 and 1896, nobody knows what was going on. There were a lot of people running around Egypt looking for stuff and selling stuff. Some of the material may in fact not have come from Egypt at all. If you go through the Bodleian collection, I actually went through the acquisition records of all 12,500 Genizah documents at the Bodleian. It's very clear. First of all, they were still acquiring things in 1910. From where, I don't know, because the Genizah had already been emptied for a decade and a half. And two, that anytime anything came to them from one of their contacts in Egypt, who were these incredibly shady characters, most of them clergy, Protestant clergy, they simply classified it as Genizah. Like, from the Genizah was just this kind of like, cover term, but we don't actually know where a lot of this stuff came from. So the comparisons would be very difficult to do. There are too many variables.
Can you go back to that slide, Marina? I have a quick.
Which one?
The one with the scribe copying.
The scribe, yes.
Just give my 2 cents.
Where did he go, the scribe? There he is.
So he's definitely. I think he's definitely copying from the bound manuscript, and I think about like European medieval archival bindings, where you see stabs through them. It's not the final binding that you see, but you'll often see in the gutter, like just stabs straight through. And it's just a way, it's just a form of tacketing. So it's this kind of long string that they're probably just trying to keep stuff together until it can get into its final binding. So there's various forms of tacketing, and one of them is what we just call like a stab binding. It's something that's just literally stabbed straight through, which is a whole genre of binding in like Japan, China today. But so yeah, maybe it's this.
It definitely keeps the sheets in order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's all they're trying to do. And even if it goes through the writing, it doesn't matter, because you know as a scribe how to reconstruct that little letter that got stabbed accidentally. That's my take on it.
And you're not thinking about the poor paleographers 1,000 years ago.
Right. Who cares about them?
That's fascinating. I mean, I hadn't actually really focused on that, but it's quite clear that the string is going into exactly the same place on each of these pages, and it does seem like it was just kind of stabbed through straight in the center. Now I really want to learn more about Central Asian chancery practice. Unfortunately, very little evidence. There is one. I mean, it's not going to help, but there's a cache of documents that has emerged from Afghanistan in the last decade and a half, and they're both in Hebrew script and in Arabic script. Most of it is in Persian or Judeo-Persian. And there's one thing that was classified as a trial of the pen, which of course immediately piqued my interest, because I said, is this really a trial of the pen? And in fact, it's a fragment of a chancery decree. But it's too fragmentary to know. And whether we can ever really get at how the Seljuks and the Ghaznavids were doing this kind of thing, I don't even know if it's possible. But I mean, reading around the sources, the thing with the Ghaznavids who were ruling Central Asia in the 10th and 11th century, right around the time that Athalibi was writing about the Battle of Talas, actually, and Samarkand was still a great center of paper manufacture. So Thalibi, who came up with the story of the Chinese prisoner of war, was basically he was a Ghaznavid official whose main responsibility was providing kind of nice information and entertaining anecdotes for the Ghaznavid courtier class so they could seem clever at cocktail parties. And the Battle of Talas thing was clearly something that was intended to kind of, like be circulated over a glass of, honey wine or whatever. We actually know quite a bit about Ghaznavid chancery practice, because one of the Chancery officials wrote like a 3 or 4 volume history, which I'm still reading through. So there may be hope for this. It's really interesting. I'll look into it.
The just thinking about that string again. With the Poti style manuscripts, there's space around that's blank, that's left, so that you're not
Yeah,
gonna poke
I've
through
seen that.
writing. And you're able to poke through those because you're writing on palm leaf. And when they switch to paper, they're still using those same styles. And even when there's not a hole through it, they leave space. On the mise en page is designed that way, even if there's not something through it. So, but when I look at that, I think archival binding. But maybe they're seeing Poti style in these trade routes. They're familiar with that bookbinding style, and maybe they're saying, well, let's just adapt this for something that we just calling an archival binding, just to keep things together while it gets copied. So it could be like this kind of hybrid. Yeah.
That's fascinating, Melissa. Thank you.
Beneath the book, are those some sort of boards? Is that like some sort of closure?
That's the pen case.
It's a pen case?
Yeah, that's a typical shape of a pen case. And they're actually still made that way. You can still go to Central Asia and buy pen cases like that. Or Philadelphia. Around the corner from me, there's a shop that sells them, but they're really expensive. Typically made out of brass with like velvet linings or something.
Marina, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
So we have